Hello, I'm Tom Caldwell, Secretary of FSBPT's Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, part of FSBPT's robust series of virtual education offerings. In response to the pandemic and our inability to safely gather in person, we have expanded topics and greatly increased our seminar frequency. Please consider joining us for one of our weekly webinars in April, including Justice 3D's Overview of Trauma's Impact on Boundary Violation Investigations on April 14th. We are excited to welcome back Justice 3D after their popular presentation in Oklahoma City at the 2019 annual meeting. While the pandemic has limited our personal interactions, the work of the FSBPT has continued, as evidenced by the exciting growth of the PT Compact and the great progress made by our tremendous committees and task forces. Thank you to our dedicated staff and volunteers. As always, please reach out to your Board of Director liaison or FSBPT staff if we could be of service. Today, I am excited to introduce our speaker, Jonathan Webb, CEO for the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs, who is presenting on the topic of unconscious bias and how it can affect healthcare practitioners and regulators. Senior staff had the opportunity to hear Jonathan speak at FARB and were greatly impressed. The topic of equity and inclusion is top of mind with your Board of Directors, and we know it is a priority for many of our members. Our speaker has 18 years of public health and association leadership experience with a focus on health equity initiatives, development, and strategic planning. He is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and holds an MBA from the University of Notre Dame, as well as a master's in public health from George Washington University. Consistent with our other webinars, please use the chat room function for questions or comments, and we will have time to address them at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to welcome Jonathan Webb.
Tom, thank you so much. And I wanted to thank you and Susan and Jeff for the kind invitation to share with this group today. And I wanted to also thank the FSBT members, one for the invitation, as I mentioned, and then also for your willingness to delve into this important topic. I know there's been some work that's already been done, some discussions you've had, but I so appreciate your desire to be bold in these conversations, to be bold in the follow-up actions, and for your interest in being a catalyst for change, and taking those steps to look first internally, but then also using those internal learnings to externally impact your members and ultimately the individuals that your members serve. I really view this as an exciting opportunity to embrace a long overdue moment to be that change catalyst that we so desperately need. And given the fact, given your positions and the seats in which you sit, you can influence policy, regulations, and systems, but more importantly, can impact individual lives. So thank you again for your opportunity, the opportunity to be here with you today and to participate in this discussion. Just very briefly, I wanted to share a note about who AMCHIP is. As Tom mentioned, we're the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs. We work with the 59 states and territories, focusing on maternal and child health, supporting those Title V MCH programs, with a focus on leading and supporting those programs nationally to protect and promote the optimal health of women, children, youth, families, and communities. We don't just say women and children because we believe that they're a part of a larger community, and that we don't want to discount. And we envision a nation that values and invests in the health and well-being of women, children, youth, families, and communities so they may thrive. So a little bit about who we are. What we'll cover today is we're going to explore unconscious bias, and we acknowledge that bias exists everywhere. It impacts our decision-making, interactions, activities, and our connections. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. We're going to have a conversation around why it's important. We're going to explore structural racism and its impact on bias. As we'll discuss, bias occurs around many social groups, but for the purposes of the conversation today, we're going to focus on race. We're going to define key terminology and then look for opportunities to leverage disruption for positive change, and hopefully lean into some potentially uncomfortable moments, but hopefully use those moments to disrupt systems and support this notion of creating positive change. So first, before we dig into the history and some of the context around why this is important and how we got here, I wanted to define some terms around what is unconscious bias. And I think, we start with this notion that bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered to be unfair. The premise that we should start with here, in my opinion, is that as a society, we are always in this perpetual state of sizing people up. We judge books by their cover all the time, and I think for my purposes, it's important for us to acknowledge that, because it's important for us to see each other's differences, but appreciate them. And typically what we do is we draw these distinctions and these prejudices, and we attach negative connotations to them. But if we're going to have a serious conversation about bias, unconscious or conscious, we need to acknowledge that it exists. And there are two types, as I mentioned, conscious and unconscious, or explicit and implicit, depending on which seat you're sitting in. What we're going to be touching base on for the most part is unconscious bias. I think the conscious bias piece is fairly straightforward. So unconscious bias, social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. From the University of California, San Francisco, this refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. It's not simply limited to race, as I mentioned earlier, or ethnicity, but also exists across a number of other social groups like age, gender, physical ability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to focus primarily on race, but I don't want to imply that because we're spending so much time discussing race, that the other biases aren't equally important. And we also need to acknowledge that conscious bias, the unconscious bias occurs more often than conscious bias, but is often incompatible with one's conscious values. The reason why this last point to me is really important, because you would find in most situations that many people reject the notion that they are racist or biased. But there is also usually an acknowledgement that in those sort of racist ideas or ideologies, that it contradicts our value systems. But you'll find more people who will be willing to acknowledge that while there may not be racist in action, there may be some biases, unconscious biases that we live with, that cause us to make these decisions around value or how we might engage with the community or individuals. So we're gonna spend more time talking about this concept of unconscious bias. So what do we know about unconscious bias? So again, everyone possesses it. So starting there as a baseline, this is just part of who we are. There are 3 decades worth of research that has shown that it has impacted hiring practices. It develops at an early age during middle childhood and develops across childhood, has a real world effect on behavior. And the good news here, in my opinion, is that we're malleable and steps can be taken to minimize its impact. So when we're children in our childhood stages, we start this sort of unconscious bias process when we are picking folks on the schoolyard, for example. I mean, that in and of itself is bad enough, but then we start to see how these impacts, these decisions or those sort of biases impact us in things like hiring practices and compensation, which is problematic. But again, the good news is that there are steps we can take to minimize that impact. So here are some examples of conscious but unconscious bias that I want to share with you. I won't go through all of them, but a few that jumped out to me were the fictitious resumes for white-sounding names, as it was defined by this researcher. Sent to help wanted ads were more likely to receive callbacks for interviews, 50% more often than those resumes sent with African-American sounding names. Science faculty rated male applicants for a laboratory manager position as significantly more competent and hireable than female applicants. I'll take a little bit of a deviation from what's on the slide here and share that the women in my family, in my life, not just from African American perspective, have shared with me anecdotally about some of the bias that they experience similar to this, where there are opportunities for advancement or opportunities for assignment, whether it's in the association world, nonprofit world, or corporate space, where decisions are seemingly made around their ability to manage or balance the work life because of some other things that may be happening with them that are unfair, and not the same type of decision-making process that might be offered or made around male applicants or male colleagues who are applying for the same type of position or opportunity. So although we're highlighting this occurrence in the laboratory manager space, I'm sure folks on this phone may have their own personal experiences around bias and decision-making for how people are acknowledged for their role and rewarded for that. Among mentored career K08 or K23 recipients, the mean salary of female researchers was about $31,000 less than males. So I won't go through all of these examples, but I think you're getting where I'm coming from about how unconscious bias may show up in some fairly straightforward practices and processes. So why is this important? Why is it important to understand this? So I have two children. One of them is a 10-year-old who, one of the benefits, if you can find them in COVID, is I've had a chance to be more involved in educational opportunities and practices at home and sitting in on some classes. And one of her assignments several months ago was her teacher sat the class down and asked them to kind of look at this image and identify things that they saw, things they noticed, things that were obvious to them as they were talking about Virginia social studies. And I was really proud of my daughter and her classmates as I listened to some of the discussion, because they made comments like, that it's a room full of white men. There's no people of color in this room. There's no women in this room. So it's, and the teacher thankfully and thoughtfully conducted a discussion around what that meant, and we also watched Hamilton during this time of being socially distant and socially isolated. And for those of you who have seen it, it made me think about the impacts of not being in the room when it happens, right? Where individuals, obviously, men and women are created equal, but if women and certain men and women aren't in the room for discussion, their voices aren't being heard. So whether it's during this time when the bias and the focus on who was allowed in the room was deliberate, people were not able to be a part of that conversation. Now, what it may look like when it's not a deliberate effort to keep people out, if there's no intentional effort in bringing folks in, you still may be in a position where you're having the same conversations over and over again without bringing those new voices, new perspectives to the table, and then unintentionally perpetuating the same sort of inequities and disparities that we're trying to undo. So it's important to understand your biases, understand the history around it, so that we don't end up perpetuating those same sort of inequities that we've seen happen in our nation's unfortunate history. So again, why is this important? Hopefully we're coming from this place of intrinsic motivation where it's the right thing to do. But if we haven't yet gotten to that place, then there's also some really concrete reasons for why this should be part of our focus. One is that our country is a diverse nation, and the stats show that we're in this moment where our country is browning. And the majority of the U.S. population will be non-white in 2050, and that doesn't obviously just happen overnight. So there's a process of the browning of our country that really puts this should put this as a priority on our radars. That if we are wanting to serve and impact all, then we need to be mindful of the changing demographics in our country to make sure that our policies, our practices, our programs, our outreach are aligned with where we are in the current moment. We want to maintain our relevance. So in keeping with the browning of our country, we also need to be focused on our pipeline, the content that we're offering to make sure that it's still relevant and valuable, and the need that it's addressing. And if we're not in the room where it happens, to make sure that voices are being heard, then there's a potential of missing what the true need is, and then the resulting content not being aligned to that. Policies and regulations should be representative of all, and this should be, as we think about equity and how to take our biases, be mindful of it, and be more equitable in our activities. This is everyone's problem and should not just fall on one group of individuals to own that and lead. I have a colleague, John Powell, who's out of UC Berkeley, and he heads the Center for Othering and Belonging. And he talks about this new social contract, which is essentially understanding that as good global citizens, we understand that my health is connected to your health and connected to your health and connected to your health. So we should have this global mindset of what it means to be a citizen of the world, and not just focusing solely on ourselves as we look to address some of these social ills. So a lot of the work that we do is centered around striving for equity. And one of the things that I wanted to draw a distinction around is that you often hear folks talk about equality. And while equality is great, it's something we should aspire to, we like to focus on shooting for equity. Because as you can see in the visual here, giving everyone the same opportunities is sort of being tone deaf to the disparities and the differences in people's makeup. So if we give everyone the same solution, it may not go as far as it needs to be if we're being targeted and intentional about how we're supporting them. So equity is what we should be striving for. And then ultimately, if we are shooting for equity or striving for equity, understanding that this may be some folks' reality, and then hopefully where we ultimately land is liberation. Because if we're looking to remove the barriers across all areas, and we do that for those folks who are most impacted and most vulnerable, then we by default start to clear the brush for everyone involved. So we're ultimately shooting for this concept of liberation. Because this is a health group, and because this is a space that we spend a lot of time in my area, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the social determinants of health, and then also you'll see later some connections to the maternal and child health space. But as many of you are familiar with, these social determinants impact an individual's health outcomes. So your economic stability, your social and community context, the neighborhood and environment in which you live, healthcare, education, these are all things that directly impact your health outcomes. And what we've started to understand is that while these social determinants are really important and really can impact and determine and show some impact on your health outcomes, we really need to take a closer look at how some of these social determinants are impacted. And what we're coming to understand more now and be comfortable with talking about now is these social determinants are impacted by our biases and the structural racism that has existed in our country. And the reason why this is important is because our unconscious bias of today has roots in conscious bias of yesteryear. And if we don't understand that and look to really dig into that and interrogate some of those policies from the past, then we don't ultimately see how those policies of the past are impacting our social determinants, which then impact our ability to be healthy. And I'm using the term because of the space that we're in from a healthcare space around health to being physical and biological health. But I think all of these things are predictors of health: educational health, financial health, community health. All these things I think are related by these social determinants. They're interconnected, and the conscious bias that conscious or unconscious bias that has existed in some of the development of these systems directly impact our health outcomes. So again, one of the things I want to touch base on in the conversation, and I would be remiss if I didn't, was the role that racism plays in these root causes of inequity. And I'm going to read this slide because I don't want to mince words with it. And I think this was really done in health, really well done in health affairs, that the United States intentionally structured its systems to repeatedly exclude certain groups of people from full participation and representation based on their race and ethnicity. Even so-called race-neutral policies enacted in recent times and today have deleterious effects on communities of color because of ingrained biases and hierarchies built to favor those who are seen as white. The system is not broken. It works as it was intended. The current visible and invisible hierarchies were erected to benefit whiteness to the detriment of those seen as other. This is important to me for us to be grounded in our conversation today, because many people will say our system is broken. You can look at any social ill we face, whether it's healthcare, education, criminal justice, and when things happen when you can see an inequity, one of the comments that typically comes up is our system is broken. And I think it's really important for us to be honest about where we are so that we can be honest and really focus on our solutions. And if we acknowledge that our system is not broken, it's functioning the way it was supposed to, the way it was designed to, then we can be really intentional about how we dismantle those systems. So what we're going to do now is briefly walk through a history of structural racism to better understand how we got here. Because again, in order for us to really, in my opinion, be focused on solutions, we have to be honest about how we got to where we are and call it what it is, so we can then build a solution that is comparable and matches the problem that we're facing. So structural racism starts with obvious history and connection to slavery. And slavery was a business. And I've seen this statistic cited in a few different spaces with some variation. Some I've seen it as low as 5.9 trillion, as high as 14.2 trillion. So I just covered the range here that I've seen, and acknowledge that the U.S. slave labor, that the present value of U.S. slave labor in 2009 is somewhere between that $6 and $14 trillion price tag. So that was the cost of slavery as a business. And that business had a real impact on families. So on the left-hand side, you see an image of a tribe, a Ugandan tribe that's rich and full of culture, who, when given the transatlantic slave trade, brought to the country. And while as a proud African American, I think we have a history that is something we should be proud of in terms of resilience. There's still an honest understanding that there was a loss of cultural identity. Many African Americans have a difficult time tracing their history back beyond the slave trade. So there was a loss of that family connection and that cultural connection. The social and community context. So from this is an MCH standpoint, maternal and child health standpoint, but you had situations where families were broken apart. And in this image, you see the treatment of women and people of color as property, where babies were taken from mothers. Mothers were being put in position that even if they weren't able to take care of their own children, were being asked to be mothers or nannies or wet nurses to someone else's children. And again, that breaking down of family has a real impact on the social and community development of a family and of a culture. Again, this is focusing on the maternal and child health space, but I think is really relevant in terms of seeing how African Americans were viewed in this time. And on the left is an image of Jay Sims, the father of obstetrics. And this image is meant to demonstrate how African American women, Black women, were experimented on, oftentimes without anesthesia, most times without anesthesia, as guinea pigs, to test things like cesarean sections and things of that nature, to improve the practice of obstetrics and gynecology, and were seen as property and guinea pigs in this respect. So they were dehumanized. This is a study here that was recently done that was conducted with the general population, first, second, and third year medical students, and then residents. And the questions varied a bit, but they spent time asking these individuals about their perception of the differences, the biological differences between Blacks and whites. Things like Blacks aging more slowly than whites, Blacks' nerve endings of being less sensitive than whites, Black people's blood coagulating more quickly than whites, whites having larger brains, whites having better sense of hearing than blacks, blacks having thicker skin than whites. These were some of the questions that were being asked in this survey. And you can see here the percentages of individuals who believed some of these things. And the thing that was surprising to me was that this study may make you think like, well, this is decades ago, centuries ago. People don't believe this now, but this was a study that was done about 5 years ago at the University of Virginia. So there's still some of these medical biases and understanding and misunderstanding of biological differences that are still alive and well and being taught in our medical system today. So then, shifting from medicine, how does it impact us in other ways? So from a criminal justice impact, many of you who have spent time in this space have hopefully heard of the Black Codes, where post-emancipated slaves or freed Blacks were a loss to the workforce. So because of that impact to the financial underpinnings of the South, you had these opportunities or this motivation to try to reclaim that lost slave or workforce. And it was done through these Black Codes, the vagrancy laws, needing to have written evidence of employment. That if you violate any of these Black codes, you could be, for lack of a better term, incarcerated again. You can be readmitted back into slavery to pick up where you left off, so to speak. Place restrictions on land ownership for Blacks and had these segregated policies under Jim Crow. Convict leasing, where state-run prisons profited from contracting with private parties from plantations to have those incarcerated individuals serve a purpose of conducting or labor for corporations. And this practice still happens today as well. And then there's some examples here of the crimes that were lynchable offenses, things like gambling, arguing with white men, attempting to vote, flirting with white women, things of that nature. These were some of the things that might either cause a Black person during those times to be enslaved again, or to be lynched and lose their life. Then, sort of fleeing from the South, many African Americans headed north looking for a better opportunity, only to find more of the same through things like redlining. And I think many of you now have probably heard of redlining and its impact on home ownership from the standpoint of companies not being willing, lenders not being willing to invest in African American areas. So the FHA would only insure loans in white areas. Black home ownership in areas made areas uninsurable. Black families weren't able to get back loans. Black soldiers couldn't take advantage of their GI Bills, even though they had the same service as their white counterparts in World War II. The impact on this was during a time when generational wealth was being created. Because if you were able to leverage some of these benefits to actually own homes, these are some of the same homes that could be refinanced, passed down from generation to generation, and create the generational wealth that is part of the American dream. And some members of our society weren't allowed to access that in the same way. The other piece with that is that, along with the investment in those communities, in terms of uninsurability, also comes the impact of not being able to invest in those spaces from an academic standpoint in terms of schools. There may be a higher level of policing that happens in those spaces as well. So it has this trickle down impact of creating these gaps in health outcomes, these gaps in the social determinants, and the gaps in the access to the American dream. We'll talk very briefly about the access to the impact it had on housing, education, and the access to care in a moment here. I did this presentation, or shared a version of this presentation to my colleagues in Oklahoma, and I grabbed this note just to demonstrate that this is still happening today. So although this is a historical look back, we have not advanced as far as many of us would like it to. So this is an article from 2018, where there was analysis that found racial disparities in Tulsa and Oklahoma City in terms of mortgage approvals for African Americans and versus their white counterparts. So today's impact, we're seeing this still in mass incarceration. Higher education still has wealth gaps, earning gaps among women, African Americans in hiring, and then this racial wealth disparity. So this, I won't spend too much time here, but quickly, you see that 1 in 9 men are incarcerated here. So the orange is the person who's incarcerated. 1 in 17 white men are incarcerated. 1 in 3 black men are incarcerated. 1 in 6 Latino men are incarcerated. And same statistics here for women. And if you were to look at this, some of the conclusions that many folks come to is that, well, some of these groups are committing crimes at higher rates than others, which is just factually not true. So blacks and whites use pot at about the same rate, but blacks have been nearly 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana. More African Americans are under correctional control today than they were enslaved. And this last bullet always floors me when I get a chance to share these presentations. But due in large part to mass incarceration of black fathers, a black child born today is less likely to be raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery, which just blows my mind when you think about the intentionality around separating black families during slavery. And now it's just because it's been woven into our DNA, it continues to persist, and at a greater clip, it persists. One sort of anecdotal thing I'll share with you with respect to this topic is that my wife is an attorney, and she used to be an attorney for a local government. And in that local government space, she had the ability to see some of the crimes that were coming across her desk that were committed by the townies, so to speak. And then also because there was a large university in this community, she had a chance to at least be made aware of that, even though the actual policing was done by the institutions, the university's police. And what she noted that just kind of supports the first bullet here is that there were crimes that were happening, similar crimes that were happening on campus, that were happening in the communities. And in most cases across the board, the individuals who were committing these crimes on campuses were given something like academic probation. There may be some community service within, or some sort of reformative process that happened that didn't result in any criminal implications on someone's record. Same offense happening in the community would land someone in the criminal justice system, potentially with some level of felony on their record, which then also impacts their employability. So I'm tossing this out there as just as an anecdotal offering for how our criminal justice system, intentionally or unintentionally, depending on which side you sit on, has a real impact on the lives of the people it touches. Impact to family here, I won't spend too much time here, but this just talks about how African American children increasingly come into indirect contact with the U.S. criminal justice system at a higher clip than their white counterparts. And many folks will say, well, just educate yourself. If we again, from an equal standpoint, provide access to these educational opportunities, everything will be solved. This slide here from Brookings tells a different story. Without going through each area here, I will highlight the light blue area for blacks and the dark blue area for whites. So you can see here in the light blue area, these are African Americans with bachelor's degrees, and in the dark blue area for whites is white individuals with no bachelor's degree. And you can see that the median net worth for a white individual with no bachelor's degree is still higher than that for a black individual with a bachelor's degree. So education is not the cure. I'm a huge proponent of education, but it's also not the solution, the simple solution for closing these gaps. Racial wealth gap. Again, won't spend too much time here, but this, as you can see, the light blue areas are the white household median wealth. The darker brownish color there is black household median wealth. And then you can see here the orange is the Hispanic household median wealth. So there's some disparities in that also. And this just hammers that point a little bit further home for folks. Discrimination in hiring practices. So we talked about some of the callbacks that we saw in the unconscious bias slide earlier. But I will spend some time on figure 9 there, where again, you look at the blue box, 14% there versus the brown box that's 17%, and you again can see the number of Black individuals who will get callbacks with no criminal records versus the number of whites who will get callbacks with a criminal record, and the numbers are still again skewed in favor of whites. So I'm really just giving you a snapshot. We could spend a lot more time talking about this, but I'm giving you a snapshot of what the research has shown us, that racism and these biases are the root causes of inequity. And I did, although I spent a lot of time talking about African Americans, the research also shows that the Native American experience is very similar to that of African Americans. They still feel the legacy of U.S. mistreatment. They have high rates of poverty, housing challenges, job discrimination, and social isolation. And the adults are twice as likely as non-Hispanic white adults to experience psychological stress. And 1 in 4 Native Americans lives in poverty. So why does this history matter? We've taken some time to live here for a minute. So why does this matter? It's important to understand these circumstances because you're serving these individuals, or you're coming into contact and encountering these as your members. So it's important to understand these circumstances that those you're serving or reaching out to have experienced, because that hopefully provides a different lens for how you may view or how you may engage them, or how you may structure your programs when you're thinking about adjusting your pipeline, or how you're structuring your board examinations, or how you're doing outreach to different communities to better understand how to be more focused and targeted on your solution. I think it's important for you to be an ally and really lean into this notion of being an ally for your members and prospective members. One of the things I really want to sort of emphasize here is this third point that could have potentially been the first point in this section, is that it's important for us to reframe the narrative. Because when you look at some of the systems that have impacted individuals of color, the narrative can often be put on them, that there's something about you, because of your education, because of your interaction with law enforcement, because of ... because of places you come from. It puts that blame on, it's victim blaming, puts that blame on them. When you start to understand the history of this, it reframes the narrative to actually look at the individual as being impacted by the systems, which then also hopes to change your focus from necessarily or simply focusing on how you support the individual, but zooming out and seeing how you impact the system, so that the individual's burden is lighter because the system has changed to meet their need. It also should hopefully help you to understand that individuals who have been impacted by these systems are resilient. There's value in their experiences, and there's an opportunity for you to see them as partners in this effort and not projects that you have to work on. That savior mentality typically serves the individual seeing themselves as a savior, and not as much, it doesn't go as far enough to support those individuals who are and should be valued for their lived experiences. The other piece with this is that, again, as I mentioned before, understanding this history helps to target your solution and make it more actionable, versus something that feels like it's a great thing to do and maybe a great thing to do, but doesn't scratch the surface enough. And as I mentioned before, we don't want to perpetuate the same disparities unintentionally, because without an understanding of our history, we are destined to repeat it. And having this understanding of historical occurrences helps to build trust with those individuals that you're trying to partner with. So there are a couple of slides here that I think really hammer this home for me. And Lyndon Johnson said this: you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. And the visual for this, for me, is this notion of how we impact this system. And if I was in person, I'd ask individuals how many people have played Monopoly, and in most examples, 100% of the hands go up, given Monopoly's popularity. And the example or scenario I usually offer is, if you had a family of 4 that sat down to play Monopoly. 3 started playing, and the 4th was asked to sit in the corner, finish homework, finish chores, do something else, the Cinderella type of thing, right? Go clean while we get ready for the ball. If you have those 3 individuals, family members, sit down and play Monopoly, by the time you invite that 4th person into the game, assume that those individuals have been around the board 3 or 4 times. If they've been around the board 3 or 4 times, by the time that 4th person, Johnny, enters the game, there's no property. There's people that probably put up houses. They may have even put up hotels. And by the time that person enters the game, they're really just trying to get around the board, either going from community chest to chance, trying to maybe go to jail if that's your strategy, or just get around the board to get back to go to collect $200. So you go around the board again, just paying folks rent. And in many ways, if we don't acknowledge the history and acknowledge that we've created this board in this way, then we create programs and create solutions that actually give individuals $200 to pass go, but never take a look at why the individual is not able to own a house or own property or own a hotel. So although those programs that we have that may support them getting around the board are great, if we just stay there and don't look at our history, then all we're doing is creating is supporting a system that allows folks to go around in this circle and not actually addressing what the true need, which is why we have this situation where they keep staying in that hamster wheel, not able to own property or own houses or those type of things in this example. So I hope that analogy helps to make it a little more clear for folks in terms of why this matters and why understanding the history matters, so our solutions can be targeted. As I start to come to a close here, I want to introduce a couple of points around what can be done. We've talked about unconscious bias. We talked about conscious bias a bit. We talked about our history and structural racism. But these 2 new points here are around being, really 1 point split into 2 around being anti-racist. Because it's not okay to simply not be racist. We must actually embrace this notion of being anti-racist. And what this means for me is, and Ibram Kendi, if you read this book on his book on how to be anti-racist, he talks about the efforts it takes to be anti-racist, and that individual being one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So what that means again is if you are in the class of individuals who has the advantage or receives the advantage, it's not enough to just sit back and say I'm not racist. If we're actually looking to be equitable, we need to actually do those things that are challenging and interrogating policies and looking at ways for things to be more equitable. If I am an individual, and I'm not just trying to say this in a negative way, but if I have if things have been, if friends of mine have stolen something and I'm a part of that, and I sit back and I receive the spoils of their conquest, it's not enough for me to not have been a part of the theft. But if I'm actively looking at how to make that situation better, there are things I might be doing with law enforcement, things I might be doing with them, challenging why things have happened, to actually be more engaging and more focused on how to really bring equity to that situation, bring change to that situation. So it's not enough to say I wasn't a part of it, I wasn't racist. We need to actually start interrogating those policies and those programs in a different way. The other aspect of being anti-racist, as Ibram Kendi talks about, is being one of those individuals who expresses the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. So this goes back to my notion earlier that we don't look at individuals as being broken. We all have value, we all have benefit, we all have lived experience and have some level of resilience. We don't need to be developed. And while there is support that we may all need around education or support, individuals aren't by themselves broken. The systems around us have created the advantage and the disadvantage. And if we're really looking to be anti-racist, we need to have that mindset and adopt that mindset as we move forward. I've said this a few times, so I won't spend the time digging into this more deeply, but we must call out the problem so our solution is appropriate. And as you start to think about how you strategically work on these problems from the lenses and the seats in which you sit, it's important to have a strategic roadmap, not just doing things because they feel good, but understanding how each milestone moves us closer to a desired end goal. We're working from our strengths. We're partnering because this issue is too big for just one organization or one individual to impact the change that we want to see. And in this effort, challenging you to be bold, because some of these ideas may not sit well with folks, and it may not be the most comfortable conversation to have when it needs to be had. But challenging individuals to own this anti-racist mentality and being bold in our efforts. And then with that comes, again, being intentional and being focused, like we're doing today, and having this conversation to better understand how we can dig in. Other things that can be done in terms of addressing your bias is to continue to educate yourself, be willing to engage in honest conversations, have this enhanced self-awareness, really take a hard look at instances you may have participated in that may not have been equitable, not because you're were intentionally being that way, but because this is kind of unfortunately how our society has functioned. Just being self-aware for how we're engaging with individuals, how we're interacting, and challenging ourselves and holding ourselves to a higher standard on that now that we know better to be able to do better. Meaningfully engage with diverse groups. So if your friend circle looks and thinks like you, be mindful about how you engage with others so that your perspective is broadened. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation calls it the blue marble thinking. Getting outside of your community, your area, and really engaging with and understanding how others perceive things. So your views are expanded, and your values are challenged and zoomed out from ones that may be more focused on those limited things around you to how you're impacting others and engaging with others that may not look like you or share the same beliefs. One of the things that I'll talk about in a second here that you can do from an organizational perspective, excuse me, is this equity audit. So taking a look at your organizational practices to better understand how your policies and your hiring policies, your contracting policies, your board makeup, your committee makeup, doing this audit or assessment to better understand whether or not your practices are equitable. Because sometimes our blinders may be on because these are things we've done all along, or it makes sense to me. There's a logical way of doing this, but when you think about the logic is being based around individuals who think like you, or look like you, or act like you. So having a group come in who can, with a fresh set of eyes, help to do an equity audit for you and assess those practices that you have and policies. And then, as I mentioned here, being intentional, identifying the problem, understanding what you can realistically impact, setting key milestones, tracking your progress, and then being willing from a quality improvement standpoint to really dig into what you can do differently. What I will say about determining what you can realistically impact is organizations like ours have a lot more power than we give ourselves credit for. I'm encouraging folks to, in order to leverage disruption for positive change, to accept the challenge to be anti-racist, to interrogate those policies and practices that I mentioned, to understand the barriers your members face. And this requires an intentional engagement of individuals who may not look like you or share the same value system that you have, or may have different sexual identities, race, gender. Individuals that may not necessarily be in your immediate network, really embracing and engaging them to get a better understanding of things like financial burdens they may experience, whether or not it's easy for them as they try to navigate their professional discipline, to find mentor support. Given some of the work-life balance that they may or may not have, because they may have to work harder, given some of the statistics earlier, or work in different spaces, or work multiple positions, or do different things, given the social terms we talked about, they may not have the bandwidth to participate in committees or fellowship opportunities or other things that may come a little bit easier for others who don't have the same experience. So spending time with them to understand those types of things, the years of experience that they may or may not have because of the things we just talked about. Are they being pigeonholed? In some disciplines, if you look a certain way or you had a certain experience, you're the person who always gets pinged to do this. As a person of color, Sometimes you always get pegged for to lead different conversations or lead different groups because you might be able to better attract or engage folks who understand your story, so to speak. So engaging with your members helps to really dig into these challenges, so then you can start to make sure you've tailored a solution that directly speaks to some of the things they've brought to your attention. Better understand the impact of your policy and practices. We talked about that. We talked about strategically partnering. And then, as I mentioned here, engage in honest conversation, because these honest conversations will help you to better understand your perceived organizational value, the value to your membership, whether or not there's diversity in your pipeline or how that is being perceived or actual. And then we'll also help you to better understand whether or not there's diversity in your leadership and the boards as I believe necessary. Very quickly here, if you're interested, my organization has recently undergone this same process. We've done an equity audit. We spent some time talking to impacted members and community partners that we were engaging with, and we came out with a statement that we've termed "We're All In," because we went through this process to better understand. We called it the Busted Lips Tour, where we talked to folks and better understood how we had either directly or indirectly impacted them, intentionally or unintentionally. And because of that, we, in our statement, identified racism as a public health crisis. But then we also talked about, we apologized for the role that we may have played in creating these inequities. And then we identified areas in which we were committing to be better, do better, and how we were looking at valuing lived experiences, being truthful about our history, committing to engage with those organizations that we had not partnered with in the same way in the past. But we talked about these things in that statement and made it more of a call to action. So that we were inviting others to join us, and then also putting this out there in writing so folks could look at us and say, well, in 2 years, 3 years, what have you done in terms of examining current and new policies? What have you done in terms of educating yourself? What have you done in terms of ensuring funding and contractual awards are equitable for those you're engaging with? So we went through this process and thought it was important from a reconciliation standpoint to first admit our role that we played, and then start to put some action into place so people could hold our feet to the fire. Last but not least here, I believe we're stronger together. As I mentioned earlier, these challenges are too big for one organization. We have to think outside the box because the status quo is not good enough. We have to make sure this is part of a long-term plan, not just something we're doing now because people are talking about it. We should make sure we stay in our lane as we lead from our strengths. Identify these milestones so that we know how we are moving forward. I think there's a maybe bad analogy I heard one time that asked how you eat an elephant one bite at a time. So we need to celebrate those milestones, celebrate every bite as we're eating that elephant, and then working our plan and sharing those successes as we do it. Teamwork definitely makes the dream work. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to have this conversation with you because I see you as members of our team. And I firmly believe that we can bring about the change that we want to see in these outcomes if we align to work together to be champions for equity. And then the last quote here, because if I haven't given you enough quotes already or enough cliches, this is one of my favorites, that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I'm excited to be walking in this journey with you. And with that, thank you for the opportunity to share. And here is my contact information.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very enlightening presentation. And I'm sure that it's likely uncomfortable for many folks to realize or to hear that, just by being passive and not being anti-racist, that is an implicit bias in itself. So certainly much to think about. I'll go to the chat room and see if we have some questions. There's a lot of folks that agree and that this was a great topic and are very thankful for the presentation and the fact that you talked about both the how and the what can be done. I don't see any specific questions. So Jonathan, if you don't mind, I'll kick it off with one. We certainly recognize that that health disparities, a great reason for health disparities is a lack of diversity in the workforce for the various healthcare professions, and we are certainly not exempt from that. Do you have any specific ideas on what things may be done, whether through the educational process or what you know about current policies that could help address that disparity? I know it's a long-term solution, but do you have any immediate thoughts on suggestions for improvement?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, and again for the opportunity. I'll first start off by saying, one of the things that I would highlight is that my thoughts on this is really just representing one individual's thoughts. I've read about it, I've been working on it for a long time, but I represent one voice, and I think related to the physical therapist realm, it's important to engage individuals who've actually walked through the certification and accreditation process to better understand what specific pain points or challenges they may have, because they would offer much richer solutions and suggestions that I might have just being from the outside looking in. That said, I think there are a number of things that the healthcare profession can do in general. One, there's a lot of conversation now around loan forgiveness, because you understanding some of the financial challenges that come with not just getting through your educational experience, but on the back end of the process, being saddled with those huge financial debt. It may not be able to receive the same wage as others in the same space. And even if those individuals who are in the same space, those wages may not be compatible with the loan burden they might have. So there's been discussion around that. I think taking a look at again some of those upstream solutions to better understand how or why individuals of color may or may not be able to get into the field or stay in the field because of their specific challenges, I think would be high level suggestions to have a strategy that looks at what's happening now, but then thoughtfully engage with some of those subject matter experts, some of those individuals who are in your space who are willing to share their story, who could help you to identify some upstream strategies as well.
Great, good feedback. We've got a member that's encouraging that you give this presentation to all lawmakers and law enforcers, regulators, especially Congress. So I'm sure you would if given the opportunity.
Absolutely, thank you for that.
Another question from a member, Jonathan, going down is, how can organizations that are very homogenous avoid the pigeonhole issue? How can we embrace our few alumni of color without making them feel that we're expecting them to teach us how to treat them? The last thing I would want to do is make someone feel quote unquote token.
I think that's a really great question, and it starts, in my opinion, with a relationship and an honest conversation with those individuals, because this all too often these conversations end in putting the weight back on the people who've been impacted to do the education to change the system. And while I think you'll find a number of folks who are excited about the opportunity to do it, right? The system being changed should not solely rest on their shoulders. So I think one of the ways to do it would be to first educate, take the effort to educate yourselves in the process. Build on honest conversations with individuals, and if there's an interest in engaging with them, treat them like a partner. Is this something that I can engage you in, because I'm on this journey to do ... and I love to get your help and your insight with it, because for many this could be a re-traumatizing discussion, a re-traumatizing effort. So I think approaching them with that respect and the humility in conversations, I think is first and foremost. And then when you're thinking about with the solutions they may offer, make sure that they feel valued and heard. There's a response and a communication feedback, so they're not just tossing things out that go nowhere. That you are intentional about sharing power in those spaces, so they're not the only, if you're engaging them in a conversation, they're not the only person of color on your board only person of color involved in the conversation, as if their voice represents all African Americans in that experience. So really be thoughtful about how you share and shift that power in those moments, and be okay if they say, I'm not ready for it right now, but I'll come back to it. You can come back to me later. So really just starting with that, the open, honest, and humble dialogue to better understand how they want to be engaged. And then if they're being engaged, share that power in a way that doesn't make them feel token because they're the only one coming to the table and now we're turning to you. And as I mentioned before, really engaging with and aligning to the concept of being an ally. Because you can have individuals who are allies who don't look like me, who still get it, and not discounting those folks who are well-intentioned in this process also.
Jonathan, well, I'm going to wrap up with one final question as we're running close to our end point here. But a question really from the opposite perspective. What are some strategies you recommend to create safe and inclusive spaces where colleagues of color feel comfortable enough to have honest conversations about their lived experiences?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question to end on, Tom, because there's a lot of conversation around this. So I think safe is relative, right? Because when we I don't mean it to be cheeky with that, but when I've had conversations with folks and talked about creating safe spaces, I think the safety of being able to have a person of color be honest in their conversation is really important. And I think making sure that people understand that because they've expressed an honest opinion, even if it's not one that you share, it's that person's lived experience. In the same way you might have that same conversation with a person around gender identity or sexual orientation or gender. You know, if you're inviting a woman to have a conversation or a person of a different sexual orientation to have a conversation, not vilifying that individual for having an opinion of a process that's different than the one you experienced. So making sure that you're being honest with yourself, if you can have those conversations as a person who's a white male or who's in an advantaged position, and not have there be this backlash for an individual because they've been honest with you. The other side of the safe conversation space is that the individuals hearing that, it may be uncomfortable for them to learn that a process that they've aligned to, they've supported, may be negatively impacting someone. So the safe space that is there might not be the safest space for them, because in order for me to be honest with my comments, I have to be mindful that I have to be open and be able to share those, and I shouldn't also have to then have the burden or the weight of making sure that you can hear the hard truth. I still think that conversation ideally should be respectful, but if there's some pain there, the individual hearing that needs to be able to process and understand there's pain there, and being willing to have less safe space for them from an emotional standpoint, knowing that because they've opened up and been more vulnerable, allowing to hear this, that they'll invite others to be more vulnerable in their sharing of their story. So safe for the individual sharing and knowing there's no backlash, and the person hearing needing to be comfortable being uncomfortable, so that they don't place their weight of being safe on the individual sharing their story, if that makes sense.
Well, fantastic. We've reached our time. Jonathan, I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Federation. The questions are still pouring in. My sense is that you'd be willing for us to get you some of this follow-up questions and perhaps get a little more follow-up response as well. We don't want to take advantage of your time, but we really appreciate the enlightenment that you brought to this topic.
No problem, Tom. This is an area that I'm obviously very passionate about, so I'm happy to engage whenever you like me to. And thank you for the opportunity again.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank all of our attendees. We are going to sign off. Continue to direct your questions. Once we leave the webinar, you feel free to continue to direct questions to your board liaison or to Federation staff, and we'll do our best to get back with you. Thank you for your time today.